2,500 years ago, a Greek city flourished in a quite spectacular way. Out of this place came extraordinary things: philosophy, theatre, and a great political idea. The city was Athens, the idea, democracy. Democracy triumphed briefly, then was forgotten. Yet today we venerate it as the cornerstone of Western civilization. In Washington, the greatest superpower in the world champions Athenian ideals: liberty, equality, and freedom of speech. But are we really the guardians of Greece's golden age?
These perfect white columns seem to me to be a great metaphor for what we've done with the classical past. We've taken the world of the ancient Greeks and we've whitewashed it. We've turned it into a kind of fantasy. We look back at ancient Athens and we see what we want to see, not what was actually going on.
I'm going back to ancient Athens. To dig deeper, to look at the grit as well as the glory, and to discover the true story of democracy.
If you say the name Athens, certain images immediately spring to mind. A beautiful Greek vase, enlightened philosophers, the Parthenon. This is a place that we cherish as the first free and equal society, a good, solid basis for our story of democracy.
But beneath the Golden Age ideal was a city that constantly voted to go to war, and that ruthlessly carved out an empire to enrich itself. A city which championed freedom of speech, but couldn't tolerate criticism from within. And now's the perfect time to dissect the idealised picture of Athenian democracy, because so much has recently been discovered that casts new light on what actually happened here in the Golden Age. "500 years before the birth of Christ, 3 centuries before the rise of Rome, the world was dominated by the great empires of Asia. Europe remained the province of primitive tribes. But this world order stood on the brink of cataclysmic change. A new power, Persia, had swallowed up the great civilizations of the Middle East, forming the world's first superpower. The empire of the King of Kings spread from the mouth of the Indus to the gates of Europe. But beyond the borders of this first world empire, a small, dynamic place was making a noise. Wedged between east and west lay a mountainous collection of islands and strips of land, each ruled by one of hundreds of rival city-states. Just one of these was the ancient city of Athens. In the 6th century BC, Athens was dominated by the Acropolis, a jagged fortress of prehistoric limestone, crowned with simple stone structures where the people made sacrifices to their gods. In its shadow was the Agora, the centre of the city, where the Athenians came to buy and sell, talk and debate. It was the hub of Athenian life, one of the busiest, noisiest places in the Greek world.
It's probably huge private buildings and small sanctuaries and things of that sort.
Archaeologists have been excavating this site since the early 1930s. Their basement storerooms are packed with artefacts from 5,000 years of Athenian life. John Camp showed me round.
How many artefacts have you got in here?
Catalogued one, something like 250,000. And then we keep a great deal of the pottery and fragments because that tells us the date. And down here...
The layers of archaeology here show us that Golden Age Athens was built on prehistoric foundations.
To look before it was the civic center, it was a burial ground. And so in the Iron Age and Bronze Age, there were lots of tombs. We have several hundred tombs, and so we have the remains of various people who were buried here long before this was the center of town.
So this is, what, about 1000
Somewhere
BC?
between 1000 and 1500 BC.
I think we always forget that the classical Athenians were walking on the ghosts of the past. You know?
Yep, very definitely.
In recent centuries, the Greek states had emerged from a dark age and transformed themselves. Greek shipping now spanned the Mediterranean, making trade with Palestine, Africa, Italy, and the Black Sea. These were warrior societies, but the Greeks didn't go in for individual heroics, they fought as one. In massed ranks of soldiers called hoplites, they protected one another with their shields. All across the Greek world, populist military dictators, tyrants, backed by these citizen armies, grabbed power from traditional elites. Ironic that in Athens, the path to democracy was smoothed by tyranny. Tyrannos is a Near Eastern word, which initially referred to relatively benign rulers who were sometimes even supporters of the common people. But as time went by, the Greek tyrants started to live up to the name as we understand it. From the 5th century BC to the present day, tyrant has become synonymous with an abuse of power. By the end of the 6th century, Athens could no longer tolerate the vindictive regime of the tyrants. They were expelled by a group of aristocrats who began fighting amongst themselves. It was this conflict that would help spark democracy. On the one side, Isagoras, backed by Athens' rivals Sparta. On the other was Cleisthenes, who desperately needed a tactic to counter his enemy's military muscle. Cleisthenes came up with a shocking plan. He appealed to the mob, the rabble, hoi polloi as they're called in Greek. The historian Herodotus tells us that Cleisthenes welcomed into his faction the ordinary people.
If you are a member of the elite, you thought the people were not the people as a whole. It's the masses, it's the unwashed masses, the mob. Democracy was power of the poor people over the rich.
Now hope was stalking the streets of Athens. The people had tasted power, and although power is relatively easy to hand out, it is almost impossible to take away.
When the aristocrats tried to impose their power, the people rioted and stormed the Acropolis. They overthrew their rulers, and without knowing it or planning it, democracy was born. What had begun as one man's solution to a problem would turn in the next 50 years into a completely new system of government. No one knew that what had been invented was the first direct democracy.
At the time of Cleisthenes, the concept didn't even exist. The word democracy comes from demos, people, and kratos, power or grip.
Mind you, it caught on pretty quickly. Within a couple of generations, the word was everywhere, and soon the city would worship democracy as a goddess.
Democracy is an extraordinary surprise. They didn't replace one set of rulers with another set of rulers, as has happened for thousands of years in the West. They said, no, actually, why don't we try something extraordinary? We can rule ourselves.
In a world controlled by kings and cliques, the Athenians created, almost by accident, a remarkable experiment in direct popular rule. And they transformed their city specially to house the new system. Opposite the Acropolis, people would assemble on the hill of the Pnyx. Any citizen was allowed to attend, and a vote of the assembly was law. The assembly was chaired not by career politicians, but by ordinary citizens chosen at random for a term of 1 month. They were put up at state expense in the circular tholos, Next door was the council chamber, where 500 ordinary citizens met each day. It was their job to prepare the agenda for the assembly back on the hill of the Pnyx. If we were to follow Athens' example, we would have a different prime minister each month, selected by lot, and we would all take our turn in Parliament. They didn't elect people to make decisions for them. They ruled and were ruled in turn.
Was this section excavated?
We have reason to believe that this is one of the law courts.
Archaeologists have unearthed tangible proof of the Athenian pursuit of equality.
Because of this
They found an Athenian ballot box.
When it was excavated, little bronze discs like this, 7 of them were found, and they carry an inscription on them, as you can see. They say, public ballot. And you as a juror in the law courts would be given 2 of these, one with a solid axle and one with a pierced axle.
One disc represented a vote for guilty and the other for not guilty.
You would hold them so people couldn't see which way you were voting, throw one into the ballot box, and a verdict would be arrived at.
Fantastic. A lot of thought has gone into this, hasn't it?
No, they want to make sure that the jurors don't feel coerced in any way.
Yeah, so plenty of checks and balances.
It has to be a secret ballot. The courts are tremendously important for the functioning of the democracy.
Yeah. Mind you, I'm a woman, so I wouldn't have been allowed to vote.
That's true.
I'll do it now.
To make sure that the jurors were fairly chosen, brilliant technology was devised.
This is called a cleriterion, and it was a random selection machine. Now, how it works is that individual citizens would have their names inscribed onto metal tags that would then be inserted into each of these slots. Down the side here, there would have been a wooden chute, which of course hasn't survived over the millennia, and down the chute would be sent black and white marble balls. If your name lined up with either a black or a white marble ball, it meant that you were or you weren't going to be selected that day. And because this process happened every day that there was democratic business to be done, it was impossible to bribe jurors or to pull rank so that you were always chosen. It shows just how important equality and fair play was to the early democracy.
In theory, you can be the magistrate that proposes a law, you can sit in the assembly and vote for the law, and then 4 months later you could be sitting on the jury that's going to decide how it's to be interpreted or if it's even constitutional. You can hold any office in the state.
A seismic shift had occurred, but in a world where rule by the many was confined to one city in 1,000, the survival of the infant democracy was in peril. Democracy might not have survived had it not been for a windfall that made Athens rich. At the bottom tip of the Athenian peninsula lies Laurium, the industrial heart of ancient Athens. Even today, the landscape is littered with the spoil of hundreds of abandoned mine shafts. Although off the tourist trail, Laurium has an important story to tell. That the Athenian Golden Age was actually built on silver.
People have been mining here since the early Bronze Age because the rock is so rich in mineral deposits. But then in 483 BC, the Athenians struck a giant seam of lead, carrying within it precious particles of silver. Overnight, democratic Athens was filthy rich.
Recent excavations have uncovered a complete settlement of tiny houses and streets.
The conditions here are pretty cramped, but actually it's not that different from other towns and villages of the period. What makes this place different is that. This building has just been identified by some archaeologists as the remains of a watchtower.
The living quarters surrounding the tower were not occupied by citizens, but by slaves.
Seems the Athenians wanted to keep their slaves under 24-hour surveillance. And it's no surprise they were jumpy. We are talking massive numbers. As many as 1 in 3 of the people who lived in Athens were slaves. The Athenians could be such vigorous democrats because they had someone else to do their dirty work for them.
The Athenian citizens felt their freedom all the more keenly as the owners of people who had lost theirs.
In ancient Greece, liberty has an inflection which it doesn't have in our society, namely there are an awful lot of unfree people, I mean slaves. And in fact, not far from where we're standing right now was one of the slave markets in the centre of Athens. We mustn't forget the dark underside of the democratic achievement.
Most slaves began their lives as free men and women, but were forced into a life of manual labour when they became prisoners of war. They were bought and sold, separated from their families, sterilised so as not to breed. It wasn't only slaves. In fact, 9/10 of the population were barred from voting. There was an age restriction, and it wasn't enough to be born in Athens. Both your father and your mother had to be born there too. And of the remaining free Athenians, half, like me, were automatically disqualified. Women weren't just unequal, they were believed to be demonic, possessed by daimones, spirits. They needed to be controlled, visibly restricted. In fact, the first hard evidence of the full face veil comes from Athens.
Women were not meant to be seen. All the evidence of vase painting would suggest that the woman is veiled. She has her cloak draped over her head.
Should we ever have a go?
Sue Blundell is researching the status of women in Athenian society.
And just drape it over your arm like that. Then if you want to cover your face, you can go like that.
Yes.
Lovely.
Well, look, I match. Sophocles said, "Silence is the greatest ornament of the woman." I feel nicely silent like that. I hate it. It makes me feel really claustrophobic. The message that's being sent out is that a married woman is the possession of the man.
Yes, he is the one person in her life for whom she will unveil herself, yes.
It wasn't only Athens, almost every society till the 20th century has been fiercely patriarchal. But there was, in that searing mass of experimentation, the possibility that something different could have been done. Where do we hear about that? We hear about it as a joke. Aristophanes imagines what would happen if women took over. We hear about it as philosophical thought. So Plato imagines what happens if we got rid of the family and had women as well as men as guardians of his republic.
But of course it didn't happen. Only the free men of Athens could belong to the Democratic Club, which met together on the Pnyx.
At dawn, Athenian citizens would come here to sit around on the bare rock and debate in the assembly how it was that they should run their own lives.
So we're going to do an experiment in Greek democracy. So who's for?
The purpose of life for an ordinary human being in Athens was political life.
And who's against?
It's absolutely unparalleled in world history.
So the motion's carried.
And every
Mogens Hansen is a world authority on Athenian democracy and how it works in practice.
This is where the people meet to pass their laws, to pass their decrees, to elect their prime minister, and they all do it by show of hands. That's the voice of the people. The Athenians believed the name Pnyx was derived from the adjective pyknos, which means crowded or densely packed. The Pnyx covers 2,400 square meters. A person takes up 0.4 square meters if he sits down. Thus, it could accommodate 6,000 citizens.
Important legislation needed to be endorsed by a vote of 6,000, and that's exactly the number of people Mogens has worked out could fit onto the crowded Pnyx.
But it's impossible to count 6,000 hands.
historians went to the cantons of Switzerland, where they guesstimate the vote.
First, I took photos, and then I blew up my photos. And with a pencil, I dotted each hand, so I could check that this was a fair method of deciding a majority in a large assembly.
You think this is their way of doing it?
Yes, it is. Aristotle shows that they did the same in Athens.
Just think of the hubbub of the assembly. 6,000 men here together. Shoemakers sitting next to nobles, and all debating issues which directly affected their lives. Heralds kept order, and there was a police force of slaves nearby if things got out of hand. But we're told that if the crowd really disliked one man's argument, they would shout him down until the roar reached to the skies.
So seriously did Athenians take being a player in democracy that they called people who didn't participate idiotes, which gives us our word, idiot.
Athenians actually had a word for politicians, and it was orator. People who were specially practiced and skilled in addressing large crowds. So you can get one orator to stand up against another, and in that way the people can choose. It's very important that you always have more than one voice.
This young woman is called Peitho, persuasion. The Athenians worshipped her as a goddess. They bestowed great honours on her in the hope that she in return would give them the gift of a fine speaking voice, sweet words, and a 5th century talent for spin.
In 483 BC, the Citizen Assembly had a weighty decision to make. What to do with the flood of silver pouring in from the mines?
Now, there's nothing like a discussion of how to spend a fortune to get the creative juices flowing. And one day, in 483 BC, a man called Themistocles stood up with a brave and far-sighted plan. Themistocles wasn't from one of the old aristocratic families. He was someone who'd benefited directly from the new opportunities of democracy. He was hungry, and he had the verve and focus of a man freshly empowered.
Themistocles' vision was that Athens should command the seas. Persian power was a threat to Athens' existence. Themistocles was well aware that they'd already invaded Greek lands. To everyone's surprise, the Athenians defeated a massive army at Marathon. Although the Persians retreated, Themistocles knew that it was only a matter of time before Persia's King Xerxes returned to settle old scores. He was intent this time Athens would take her enemies on at sea. Athenians needed a brand new fleet of warships, not a tax break, he argued in the assembly.
It's a tribute to Themistocles' powers of persuasion and to the acumen of the assembly that they approved his strategy. Over the next 3 years, the Athenians would build themselves a fleet of over 200 triremes.
This was a fundamental shift in the way the Athenians made war. Triremes would be the new weapon of democracy. The word trireme means 3 oars. Rowers were arranged in 3 banks, one above the other.
It's faster, it's more deadly than any warship that had been used before. This is the technology that the Athenians have to master in order to defeat the largest navy in the world, the Persian navy.
Triremes offered the perfect balance of speed and weight. They're highly manoeuvrable with twin rudders.
Athens was already a democracy. It's no accident they mastered this form of warfare. The Greeks associated the word techne, our technology, with the triremes, and that is the great Athenian strength, playing to technology, playing to innovation.
There would have been about 170 oarsmen on a boat like this. Most of them would have been packed down here. You can just imagine what the atmosphere would have been like. Very cramped, very sweaty. And then as you rowed, your face smacks up into the back of the man in front of you. But the situation here forced a feeling of community. And because these things were the engines of the fleet, you knew that your muscle counted.
The trireme is so perfect, it's hard to think of a better symbol of Athens and its democracy. The development of the fleet has remarkable political consequences, and I think the Athenians knew it. We know that upper-class Athenians were hostile to developing the fleet, and it's perhaps because they saw what was coming. Once you had a fleet, Athenian power would rest on the shoulders of the poorest people in society. The military power of Athens depended on the fleet, and so the political power followed it inevitably, and Athens became more of a real democracy.
In the east, Xerxes' preparations for conquest gathered pace. He mustered a colossal army from across his empire. Rational debate wasn't enough to decide the Athenian strategy. They needed assurance from higher powers. A 100 miles northwest of Athens in Delphi lies the sacred oracle of Apollo. In Apollo's temple, questions were put to the priestess, and her enigmatic replies were then translated by priests.
The Athenians came to ask advice. Their question: with what strategy could they best defeat the invading Persians, the mightiest army in the known world? The answer came back. Zeus grants to thrice-born Athena a wooden wall. In this, and only this, shall she be secure.
The meaning of the wooden walls was debated on the Pnyx. Some argued it meant the protective palisades on the Acropolis. If the Athenians took refuge there, they'd be safe. Themistocles was in no doubt. The wooden walls meant the navy. In a vote, the Athenians agreed with their admiral. Man, woman and child evacuated their city for the nearby island of Salamis. They waited for the battle to begin. In September 480, the Persian army entered Athens, hungry for revenge.
Xerxes found the whole territory deserted. The Persians razed the Acropolis to the ground, stole its treasures, and torched whatever was left.
These deformed statues, blistered and buckled, provide vivid evidence of the terrible fires that raged on the Acropolis. All the Athenians could do was watch as their city burned. They waited with their Greek allies on the nearby island of Salamis.
The key was to get the Persians to fight where the Athenians wanted a battle. The only way to do that was to trick them.
Themistocles sent a message to the Persians saying his men were deserting. Were the Persians to enter the straits by dawn, they could capture his fleet without a fight. He was gambling the Persians would believe him and row straight into a trap. At dawn on the 25th of September, the Persian ships filed into the narrow waters. The modern Greek navy has a base at Salamis. Captain Cosmas Christides studied the battle while training to be an officer.
Welcome on board, Captain.
He's used his intimate knowledge of the Straits to bring new evidence to the textbook history.
Here, you can see now, there is where the battle took place.
Yeah.
On the right side, there were the Greeks. On the left side, the Persians.
The Greeks were outnumbered 2-1, but the straits were so narrow that only half the Persian fleet could enter. Themistocles had lured the Persians into his trap.
The Strait of Salamis, which is around 300 yards, the Persian fleet cannot be deployed.
That's very clever, isn't it? Because you've got such a narrow area. So, as you said, you're limiting the number of Persian boats that can come in.
That's correct.
Themistocles also knew that the morning currents and crosswinds would disorientate the Persian fleet.
The wind turned them like this.
So he wants to ram the side of the boats.
And he succeeded.
The tactics of a battle were to ram the enemy and then to quickly back off before the enemy could do damage to you. The Athenians faced the best part of the Persian fleet, and they defeat them. The remaining Persian ships turn to flee. So what results is just an enormous and remarkably bloody traffic jam. It's a massacre. The blood in the water, men being speared like tuna fish. And it goes on all day.
Xerxes watched as the Persian fleet was steadily annihilated.
This victory would underpin Athenian democracy.
One factor which made the democratic experiment the way it was the Persian Wars. Just having a bunch of people coming in, taking over Athens, smashing your statues up on the Acropolis there. You start thinking, hey, why did we win? What makes us different from them? And so if there wasn't a notion of the power of the people as against dictatorship and tyranny before the Persian invasion, there was after.
All over the city, public monuments were set up eulogising the victory. The message was clear. Western democracy could and should triumph over Eastern tyranny. The schism between East and West had been set in stone.
Salamis is just a key event in Western history. All the things we associate with the golden age of 5th century Greece, the democracy, the art, the literature, the history, the philosophical debates about empire and power above all, that wouldn't have happened without Salamis.
Having triumphed decisively over tyranny, democratic Athens set its sights on building an empire.
They understood that once the Persians pulled out of the Aegean, that the Aegean would be a power vacuum, and that if the Greeks didn't move in, the Persians would come back. The Athenians simply couldn't allow that to happen.
The Greek states that ringed the coast of the Aegean formed a grand confederacy with Athens for protection against the Persians. Historians call it the Delian League, after the small island where the Allies had their headquarters. Delos was a sacred place, the legendary birthplace of Apollo and Artemis.
I think the Greeks got it right when they thought the gods of wind, sea and sky roamed round here.
It was very astute to base the League here. This was a neutral island. And also primevally sacred. A fog of mystery and superstition surrounded the place. This is not somewhere that you'd have tampered with.
To begin with, the League was a huge success. As time went on, it became more and more clear that Athens, with its vast navy, was the obvious leader of the League. Many of the smaller states found it impossible to man a fleet all year round, so it suited both sides for Athens to provide protection and take money from the Allies for the service.
To celebrate the foundation of the League, this temple to Apollo was built, and in it, a massive treasury where all the League's cash could be stored. But then, just 20 years later, the League stops building work, which is very odd, because this is the time when the Greek world is at its most prosperous. And then you realise there's something else going on here.
Building had stopped on Delos because the treasury of the League had been moved from its neutral territory to Athens itself. Allies who attempted to leave the coalition soon found themselves forced back in by the Athenians. What had once been a mutual defence pact was now looking very much like an empire. But what was behind Athens' new thirst for imperial power? Democratic imperialism may be down to something as basic as the need for grain.
Grain is the oil of the ancient world. Whoever controls its supply can keep a stranglehold on power.
Barley or wheat was the staple food of Greece. When it ran short, the people starved. Huge swathes of the landscape around Athens are rocky and infertile. This area is now built up with housing, but these spy photos taken by the RAF during the Second World War show terraces where the ancient Athenians desperately tried to squeeze maximum food out of the soil. 5th century Athens might have been riding on the crest of a wave, but it still needed to feed itself. Proof that Athens was desperate for grain was found in the most unlikely of places. When they were examining the ancient drainage system in the Agora, they found a stone recording payments to Athens. This is an inscription relating to tax, and it tells us that Athens asked Athenians abroad to pay their tax not in silver, but in ton siton, grain.
This is a great alluvial.
Now, new evidence about how the grain supply motivated the drive for empire has come from Oxford historian Alfonso Moreno.
This was much more fertile ground than Athens.
He found a whole range of Athenian forts on lush, fertile Euboea. Athens had conquered Euboea, reducing its population to serfdom.
So it was very unfortunate to live on flat, fertile land. You do attract gannets.
Yes, especially unfortunate if you happen to live right across a very small stream of water from the Athenians.
Following rare maps and surveys, Alfonso discovered a network of unexcavated forts, proving successive generations of Athenians spent huge resources on conquering and defending yet more of Euboea.
They went so far as to evacuate the entire population of this part of the island, and they moved it out forcibly.
How many people are we talking about?
It's a good guess that it's probably 50,000 people, and in their place are put 1,000 or 2,000 Athenians. It makes you wonder whether people realize that democracy isn't necessarily a virtuous thing.
This stone stele represents the monumental might of the Athenian Empire. You can see that all over the stone surface there are closely carved inscriptions listing the places that owed tribute money to Athens, from Palestine to the Black Sea. It's an incomplete jigsaw puzzle now, but it represents a continuous flood of money pouring into the Athenian coffers up on the Acropolis.
The domination of Euboea and the aggressive imperial project was the policy of Athens' most powerful aristocrat, Heracles. He was the darling of the people. Thucydides wrote of him that during his leadership, Athens was in name a democracy, but in fact under the rule of one man.
Heracles was following on a long tradition of competition to deliver to the people of Athens ever larger prizes, and Euboea was just the largest, the latest example of that.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? The aristocrats standing on bits of coastline like this, looking out across the sea and wondering where it is that they can lay their hands on next.
You know, I think that's more or less precisely what they did. This was a kind of competition. It was, in many ways, the transferal of the archaic ideal that you see in the Olympic Games to a political arena. And democracy was the ultimate way of playing a competitive game with other members of the elite. And the people derived great riches from the invasions, the feats of the aristocratic prowess of their leaders.
First they had the silver mines, and now they had an empire. Democratic Athenians had more money than they could spend.
Pericles used the surplus in a brash new way to create for the people a symbol of their own imperial glory. In 447 BC, work began on the defining symbol of ancient Greece, the Parthenon. The modest temple of Athena that had lain in ruins since the Persian invasion was rebuilt on an epic scale. It was the ultimate expression of Pericles' vision. For 15 years, citizens, slaves and foreigners laboured side by side to construct one of the most celebrated buildings in history. But the million tourists who visit each year find a site covered in scaffolding and cranes. The restoration is giving new insight into the original construction.
Do you know how many would have been working on here when it was first built?
Yes, I believe that it was about 200 people for the erection of the Parthenon.
200?
Yes.
And from sunrise
working
to
from
sunset?
sunset.
Yeah.
Eating in the building. We found between the members, we found bones from chicken and shells.
Seashells?
So, yes, seashells.
Fantastic.
They are sitting over there, looking the view, fantastic, and eating upstairs.
That's brilliant, so having kind of shellfish picnic while they build the Parthenon.
The Parthenon was adorned with reliefs, including those supreme aristocrats, the Athenian cavalry. It was the biggest temple in Greece.
Every powerful city or state wants to express his strength. I think this is an appearance of that.
Yeah, a monument to power.
Yes.
Well, the Parthenon is always called a temple. What people forget is it was primarily a bank. It was a place in which we put money, treasures, and it wasn't used for any religious ritual that we know. Not only does it put its money and treasures there, but it was built out of money from the empire. So far from being a symbol of a pure white Hellenism, is a symbol of how Athens asserted power over a lot of rather smaller states and used it to glorify itself.
But Pericles' beloved project was stirring up trouble. Factions in the city were enraged that the Democrats could steal from the defence fund to provide sops for the people. They brought their complaint to Pericles in the assembly. The allies must be outraged, they cried. They must consider this an act of barefaced tyranny when they see that with their own contributions, extorted from them by force for the war against the Persians, we are gilding and beautifying our city, dressing her up like a common whore. Pericles' response was as much a defence of empire as it was of its most potent symbol. The allies do not give us a single horse, nor a soldier, nor a ship. All they supply is money, he told the Athenians. It is no more than fair that after Athens has been equipped with all she needs to carry on the war to protect the allies, she should apply the surplus to public works, which, once completed, will bring her glory for all time. It's a politician very cleverly spinning the situation and writing his legacy into the history books. Athens drove her imperial project ever further. Those that resisted were punished, men, women and children massacred. It is the nature of man, Athenians said, to take power wherever he can. The strong do what they like, and the weak accept what they have to accept. In the name of democracy, they pursued an aggressive foreign policy which set them on a collision course with their rival city-states. In 432 BC, the Athenians found themselves confronted with an enemy they could not overpower. The ancient world's most formidable military force, Sparta. It was an irony worthy of Greek tragedy that Sparta, virtually a totalitarian state, now claimed to be the liberator of Greece from the tyranny of Athens, the world's first democracy. Pericles had taken Athens into a disastrous war. Yet he appears to have been brilliant at persuading his citizens that they were dying for a higher cause. At the annual burial ceremony of the city's war dead, he gave a last impassioned speech in defence of democracy and Athens. I could tell you a long story about what is to be gained by beating the enemy back. What I would prefer is that you should fix your eyes every day on the greatness of Athens. Our constitution is called a democracy because power is in the hands of the whole people. Everyone is equal before the law. What counts is not membership of a particular class, but the ability which a man possesses. They are fine and persuasive words, and for centuries we've chosen to take these as representative of the true spirit of 5th century Greece. But there are many who wouldn't have bought into Pericles' vision of a free and tolerant society. This was a time when unorthodox views were circulating throughout the city, and they were viewed as very dangerous. Democratic Athens was beginning to fracture. The evidence for how the breakup occurred is only now emerging. Words really were the lifeblood of the Athenian democracy. Here, there are many millions of words that were written in the 5th century BC, which haven't even been translated yet. An unofficial history of the city is starting to emerge. In the next programme, I'm going to see how bitter rivalries, both in and outside Athens, created havoc for the democracy, and how newly discovered documents are changing our ideas of the Golden Age.